path of God's will, that doesn't mean that everything's always going to be smooth sailing. Generally speaking, following God's plan for our lives and following God's will and ordering our lives under His authority will eliminate a lot of the bumps in the road, won't it? Some of you guys can testify to some of that too. Some of you guys have been down some bumpy roads. Some of you have been in some deep valleys because you didn't seek God's will and because you didn't trust God and because you didn't acknowledge Him in all of your ways. And you know the kind of difficulties, and I know the kind of difficulties that sin can bring, and I know the kind of difficulties and the kind of hard roads that can result from not seeking God's will and from not trying to acknowledge Him in all of my ways. And so generally as a principle, when we do that, God will make our way straight. God will fill up the valleys. God will smooth off the hills. God will remove the obstacles. God will give us a road to travel that's a lot smoother if we don't than we would have if we don't seek Him and if we don't try to follow Him. And so, if you want to know God's will for your life in the 25%, not in that 75% that we already know what to do, but in those issues that just pop up. Who do I marry? Where do I live? Where do I go to school? What job do I take? And on and on and on. I think the first thing to do is to seek to know God more intimately through His Word. In all of your ways, acknowledge Him. In all of your ways, know Him. Know God's character. Know what God has promised you. Know God's nature, because when you know God more intimately, you're more willing to place all of your trust on Him. So know God more intimately through His Word, through prayer, through other believers. Be willing to wrestle with the question of what does God want from me. Be willing to spend hard time in prayer. Be willing to agonize over that. Be willing to really wrestle with God about what He wants for you. Be willing to do some of that hard work, not of just saying, well, I prayed about it, and God didn't tell me. Be willing to pray and to continue to pray until God shows you His direction. Be willing to follow God when He tells you what He wants you to do, even if you're not sure about it. 2 principles of positive action. And I wish that I could give you 5 steps. I wish that I could give you 10 to-dos, and you will always know the will of God. But it just doesn't work like that. I wish I had something like that for my own life, but I haven't found it yet. But here are 2 principles of positive action. If I trust God with everything that I have, and I seek to know Him in everything and to consult Him in everything that I'm planning to do, then I found that generally He does speak to me. Generally He does lead me through His Word, through conversation with other people, through prayer, through circumstance sometimes even. But I found God to be faithful to direct my path. Not always to make it the smoothest, but to direct it when I do those things. Trust in the Lord with all of your heart. Place everything that you have, all of your confidence, everything that you are, place it on Him. Don't lean on your own understanding, but acknowledge Him in all of your ways. Seek to know Him. Seek to order your life under His authority. Seek to follow His principles in everything that you do, and He'll make your path smooth for you. I'm hesitant sometimes to share a personal example just because I don't want you to think that I'm not perfect. Actually, that's not the reason. I hope that you know that I'm not perfect. But I don't want to ever hold myself up as the example to follow, because I am certainly not. I have that tendency that a lot of us have to really seek God's will in the big decisions, but then in some of the things that are minor or we might consider more insignificant, to lean more on my own understanding. And I've had some bumpy roads because of that. But one of the biggest decisions that I've had to make over the last several years for sure was the decision to uproot my family and to come here and to become your pastor at First Baptist Nashville. And I don't want to bore you with the whole story. Maybe if you really want to hear it, you can invite me over to lunch sometime, or dinner, or even just tea. And I'll be happy to share the whole long, drawn-out story with you. It's pretty interesting, but it really started just with an unrest, in a sense, in my spirit and April's spirit there after about 6 years at Norwood, that God was getting ready to move us. But we didn't really know what that meant, and so rather than running off and typing up a resume and sending it to the seminary's resume services or through our director of missions there for our association, we just started to pray. We prayed for about a year or so, I guess. And this is not a knock against my wife at all, but she was starting to get impatient. And That's one of the ways that God uses her to compliment me. I'm more of a stay back and make sure everything is exactly right before I move, and sometimes she has to kind of kick me from behind a little bit. And so she started asking me, have you talked to Stan, who was our director of missions, have you talked to Stan about any of this yet after about a year? No, I hadn't talked to him yet. But finally I decided, well, I was going to go talk to my former pastor who's still pastoring the church that I grew up in, 50 years there. He celebrated last year. Only pastor I've ever had. I value his wisdom immensely. And so I went and sat down with him, and I just explained kind of where we were and how I was feeling. And we prayed together, and God really used him to affirm to me, it is time to go ahead and start the process. And so still I was hesitant, though. I wanted to involve as little of me and as much of God as possible. And so I did get my resume worked up, and I gave it to Stan, our director of missions, and I said, Stan, would you please pray about this with me? And so he said, you bet I will. And so presumably he prayed, and I know that we prayed. And after about 6 months, it was that April kind of kicking me from behind again. Well, has Stan said anything? Has he talked to you again? And no, he hadn't done that. And so on the day that Abigail was born, Stan called me that morning sometime, and he said, look, I have a church that I'm going to submit your resume to, and so that's great. And about 2 weeks later, he said, well, they've stopped taking resumes, and so we're just going to kind of go back into a holding pattern. And so there we were again, and we were just waiting and praying, trying to put all of our trust in God and trying to order our lives under His will and trying to not lean on our own understanding, not manipulate things from our side, but really letting Him guide us. And so one day, I guess it was September sometime, we came home from being out somewhere, and I had that message on my answering machine from a friend, Jeremy Blocker, who I went to seminary with, hadn't maybe spoken to one time in those 7 years that I was at Norwood, who said, look, Kevin, I don't know if this is, if you're looking for anywhere to go or not, but I heard about this opening in this place called Nashville, Arkansas, and you're the person who came to mind, and so I just wanted to share it with you, And so April and I kind of decided, well, maybe we ought to check this out. I'm not sure about Nashville, Arkansas. I didn't know that there was a Nashville, Arkansas. Sure, it's a lovely place, but never had the desire to live in Arkansas. And anyway, but we just decided because of how everything had happened that we ought to go ahead and pursue this. And so one thing led to another. Eventually, we made the trip up here, and after time spent in prayer with the search committee, time spent in prayer with one another, we finally came to that place. We left our initial visit up here, and we went back home, and the search committee members said, go back home and pray about this for a couple of days. We already know what God wants you to do, but we just want you to be sure about it. So I said, great, I'm going to go home and pray about it. And sure enough, we went back home, I don't know, that Friday or Saturday, and probably Monday, Mike calls me and says, well, has God told you what He wants you to do yet? And He hadn't at that point, Mike. I wasn't being dishonest, but I have this written down in a little book that I sometimes jot thoughts or prayers in. This is from November the 6th of 2012. And this is what I wrote. Such a huge life decision looming. Remaining in Norwood and being faithful to this community of believers in spite of difficulties would seem to be God-honoring. Maybe this is a test to see if I can find my contentment in serving God faithfully and not in money, possessions, houses, bigger churches, etc. Leaving and moving to Nashville, Arkansas would also seem to be God-honoring. Maybe this is a test to see if I value obedience to God more than I value living in close proximity to my parents, brothers, family, and friends. God, what do I do? I will go if you want me to go. It will be extremely difficult in a lot of respects, but I am willing to be obedient. I will stay if you want me to stay. This will also be difficult, but again, I'm willing to be obedient. Please reveal your will to me. I'm waiting on you. And so there we were in that situation of two presumably God-honoring paths of life, two things that we could do, both of which would seem to be in accordance with God's will, with God's plan for us, part of that 25%, if you will. And how do you answer those questions? How do you make those decisions? At the end of the day, after spending time trying to know God deeper and hear His voice through His Word and through prayer, And after counseling with people that I really trusted and that God used to confirm that direction to me, and after just putting all of my trust on God and saying, okay, God, if this is your will, then I'll trust you with everything I have, we made the decision to just kind of step off the cliff without knowing what was underneath there. And at this point, I think both of us would say that we feel like this was God's will and plan for us. And so, again, I wish I could tell you that there were 5 steps to follow and you will always know what God's will is. The truth of the matter is, even after the church voted and everybody, all of you were coming up, and I didn't know any of you then, but you were hugging our necks and shaking our hands. I really didn't know if I was happy or not. I really didn't know if I wanted to be congratulated or if I just wanted to get in the car and go drive back home. And some days maybe it still feels like that, but the bottom line is discerning God's will can be messy, it can be hard, there's a lot of uncertainty involved there. But if we will trust Him with everything that we have and not lean on our own understanding, if in everything we will try to know Him and to acknowledge Him and to consider His will first and follow His direction, then He'll make the way straight for us. There have been some bumps, but you know, God removed some of those obstacles. He gave us affirmation and confirmation when we needed it. He filled in the valleys, and He shaved off the hills, and He gave us the ability to travel the road that He wanted us to travel. And I think you'll find that He'll do the same for you. Seeking God's will is a sign of wisdom. Do you want to know what God wants for your life? Do you want to know what to do in that 25% of the time where there's just no clear-cut answer? Then trust God with all of your heart. Acknowledge God in all of your ways. Don't lean on your own understanding, and He will make the way